So Descartes was a 17th century philosopher, and he felt that the world should be objectively analyzed through reason. And he felt that matter and reason were two different things that linked, and that you could collect data from sensory experience. He used the term dualism when he was thinking of matter and reason overlapping. And he thought that this data collected from sensory experience should be analyzed using human reasoning. He also came up with the term reflexes and the concept that the mind could affect the body and vice versa. For instance, skin problems. He was pivotal because he came up with the concept of emancipating the being with emotions. I think, therefore I am. Locke was a 17th century mathematician and philosopher as well, and he believed knowledge comes from the senses. So observing and experiencing experiences only. And his theory was empiricism. Tabula rasa. Senses and experiences form complex ideas. So the mind is a blank slate, and he collected evidence through experiments and is relevant today because we still find this important and part of the scientific method. He replaced John Cunningham's rationalism and believed reason rather than experience is the foundation of knowledge. Berkeley went beyond this and believed that past experiences play a part in complex processes, and studied memory and inferences. Florence actually looked into the physical evidence of the brain, experimental observations with tissue removal, surgery, or electronically lesioned. Mullins is a psychology. Different parts of the brain are specialized, different sensory channels. So this is very significant. Mullins was different parts of the brain are specialized. Florence was physical evidence of the brain through tissue removal and electronically lesioned. Berkeley was talking about inferences and past memories, making up complex mental processes. Locke was knowledge comes by senses. Descartes was matter and reason link and overlap, which was he called dualism. Wundt was a subjective structuralism, which had to do with introspection. This was the start of psychology. Wundt was pivotal from moving philosophy into the field of psychology. And he felt that the brain could be broken down into structures of consciousness, like physical elements of matter. So he was looking at chemists and physicists and seeing how matter could be broken down. So he thought maybe the mind could be broken down. He observed responses to stimulus to infer how mental processes work. It was hard to tell the difference between observation versus perception. It wasn't objective. hard to report objective experiences. Past experience used to describe new ones, so it was short-lived. You can't observe inner thoughts and feelings. Everybody could respond differently to a sunset. So the big idea was psychology changed from the study of mind to behavior, from subjective internal to objective external. So functionalism was proposed by William James. It's significant of function of behavior. Why? So functionalism ties in with Darwinism and evolution, and why certain functions adapt and others remain, and what they're used for. So Freud, opposite of Wundt, did 180 from the subjective behavior to objective behavior. So what's unconsciously motivated? He believed the unconscious contains material too traumatic and causes too much anxiety to be in the consciousness awareness. So we repress our traumatic events. It was very subjective. And he is from the 1900s, and he helped develop talk therapy, self-discovery, dreams, revealing the unconscious, free association. It's a breakthrough because before this, people were confined to sanatoriums, psychoanalysis, psychodynamic theories, focus on importance of early childhood experiences, shaping the unconscious and how that process affects our thoughts, feelings, and personalities in the present. And he also invented the notions of personality. So behavioralism is observable behavior. Behavior is stimuli and response. So Thorndike came up with stamping in, stamping out. If you have a positive reinforcement, you're more likely to repeat the action. If there's a negative consequence, then you're going to avoid the same actions. Pavlov was association through experience will demonstrate cause and effect. And Watson was mean to little Albert, and this was the same thing, cause and effect. Skinner's first systematic study of reinforced stimuli and behavior. So Skinner was most known for his successful behavioral therapy and believed that mind had no place in psychology. And he had some of the first clinics to help change the behavior of mentally unhealthy patients. So behavior is observable, the mind is subjective. Science is a systematic collection of observable behavior which is logically analyzed and recorded and shared. Because of overconfidence, we have to employ the scientific method because we have false assumptions, hindsight bias, and experimental process must be adopted to safeguard our psychological research. So we employ the experimentation and scientific inquiry. Step 1, so you're going to formulate a question. How are you going to ask subject questions and how to measure and test responses? So this is called operationalizing. How you're going to ask the question and measure the responses and to whom. Question and theory. So explains and organizes lots of different observations and predicts outcome. Explains and organizes lots of different observations and predicts outcomes. Hypothesis is a testable outcome. Clear and common language to do the report so that it can be the experiment can be repeated. Test with replicable experiments. Analyze and interpret data. I think it's called data, actually. Communicate results. Problem with case studies, in-depth look at one individual can be misleading, can't be replicated, run the risk of overgeneralizing. But it can help you form more questions. Naturalistic observations, watch the subject in the natural environment, describe behavior. Surveys record responses that are consciously held attitudes and beliefs. Can ask questions can be tricky. Subtle word choices can influence the patients. So, or no, I shouldn't say patients, the subjects. So you want a random sample. So you want all members of the target group to have an equal chance to answer the questions. Correlation, how one trait or behavior is related to another. So correlation does not imply causation, though. And so 0 equals no correlation, 1 is perfect, and the other direction is imperfect. So for instance, and as one increases, the other decreases. So if you have a higher GPA, it means you'll be partying less. You cannot, so correlation is not causation. Yes, it may make sense, but cannot draw conclusions. Correlations can predict the possibility, cause and effect, but cannot prove it. So you need to do an experiment to prove something. Experiments allow investigators to isolate different effects by manipulating an independent variable. So it'd be like how much coffee you're going to drink before you go through a maze. And then the constant dependent variable would be the speed. So the dependent variable depends upon the independent variable. So you need 2 groups or more to conduct an experiment. One's a control group, which is not messed with, and one's an experimental group, which is messed with. So you need random subjects because different people have different strengths and traits. Sometimes subjects don't know what they're being tested for, and this would be a blind experiment. Sometimes researchers don't know which experimental group is the control group, so it's a double-blind procedure. The placebo is a substance or treatment with no therapeutic effect. Fact is an objective statement. Theory organizes principles, explains data, and predicts. Model is a simple, understood system. Evaluate, analyze, conclusion. Are results statistically significant? So when you're analyzing, you're looking for results, and are they significant? Cover story. Sometimes you use a cover story because if S knows why they're being observed, they might change their behavior. And it's also important to debrief your subjects when you're finished. You're going to need to get rid of tainted data. So you take the average and divide it by the test subjects. So now let's move on to the brain. Neutrons look like broccoli and our cells. Oh, I should say neurons look like broccoli in our cells. Neurons have electrical, chemical communications. Dendrites receive messages from other cells. An axon is a talker. It transmits electrical impulses to other glands, neurons, and muscles. The long part is protected by a myelin sheath and speeds up transmission. So when the myelin sheath degrades and is patchy, you have lack of muscle control like MS. Neurons transmit by sensory stimulus or by sensory stimulus to their neighbors. Dendrites are connected by synapses, which are gaps. Neurons communicate with neuron transmitters that cause motion and emotion. And there's hundreds of different kinds, excitatory and inhibitory. Everything psychological is also biological. Excitatory neurons transmit, so they rev up neuron, increases chance of action potential. Glutamate increases seizures, has to do with memory. Norepinephrine, alertness and arousal. Inhibitory neurotransmitters chill neurons out, decreasing likelihood that neuron will jump into action. GABA is a major neuron inhibitor. So if you don't have enough serotonin, leads to lack of sleep and depression, and is also linked to appetite. Acetylcholine enables muscle memory and action learning. Dopamine influences emotions, movement, attention, learning. Excessive amounts is linked to schizophrenia, addiction, and impulsive behavior. And not enough is depression and Parkinson's. Neurotransmitters are nervous system couriers. The endocrine system is slow chemical communication system, a set of glands that secrete hormones into bloodstream. So hormones are chemical messengers, travel through the blood to affect tissues. And they deal with attraction, appetite, and aggression. So hormones linger. That's why when you're angry, it's hard to let it go. Pituitary gland is responsible for growth hormone, oxytocin, which has to do with trust and social bonding, and is the master gland. Tells the other glands what to do. So it's part of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is part of the brain. So the brain is behavior, sleep, and physiological. So it's has to do with a lot of things. So simple animals have less complex functions, and they can need to worry about rest, breath, and eat, and they have less folds. Their brains are more smooth. The inner brain is the old brain, and it's anchored by the brain stem, the medulla, which has to do with the automatic system, the pons, which is movement, the thalamus, which is sensory, the cerebellum, which is non-verbal learning, perception of time, emotions, and voluntary movement. Okay, so that's all part of the old brain, which is brainstem, medulla, pons, thalamus, and cerebellum. And the higher functioning system is the limbic system, and that has to do with the hypothalamus, which is hunger, body temperature, regulates the endocrine system, pituitary gland, pleasure, and reward. So the hypothalamus is fighting, fleeing, feeding, and sex. Amygdala has to do with fear, aggression, memory, consolidation. Hippocampus is learning and memory. Cerebrum has 2 hemispheres, 85% of weight. They think, speak, perceive, connected by the corpus callosum, which is a wide band of axon fibers, covered by a thin layer of neurons called cerebral cortex. The brain is filled with folds called fissures. Their cells are called neurons. So the motor cortex sends messages from the central nervous system to muscles and functions of the body. There's a correlation between dendrites, the amount of dendrites you have, and skill profession. Axons carries electrical impulses, which called action potential, from cell body to neuron cells. Inside the cell, there's a balance of positive and negative charged ions. Depending on the message, it inhibits or excites. Excitatory depolarizes, it increases action potential. Cells communicate electrical chemical messages. The spinal cord works for brain, sends messages, controls rhythmic movement, and organizes reflexes. Contralateral means you see with your right eye, then your left side of the brain is processing that. Sensitivity matters, not size. For instance, fingers versus necks. So the prefrontal cortex, I should say, is reasoning, logic, strategy, and personality. And if you have Brock's area damaged, you can talk but can't write. Left hemisphere is language, math, music, cause and effect, speaking and reasoning. And the right hemisphere specializes, creates, recognizes spatial ordering objects. There's 23 eggs, 23 semen, and then they create a zygote with 43 chromosomes. And we do all of this to survive and reproduce.